Thank you, Guy, for being here with us today. I watched some of your YouTube videos, and it was very interesting what you've been doing. I want to start by a topic that's dear to our heart. As property managers, we usually get buildings when they're completed, and we have to deal with them. And I often ask myself the question, the discipline of engineering and design should be centered around residents, but we often see that engineers focus more on the engineering aspect than the people aspect during design. Although, however, I can see that newer buildings do better. We have more natural lights in newer buildings. We have better air quality because of newer AC and HVAC systems. In your opinion, moving to master communities and buildings, how do you design master communities with health and longevity at the core of developments from the design stage?
I think it's a very interesting question because we've actually been building cities that have not been human-centric for decades now. Yeah. When we look at the neighborhoods that actually have the healthiest statistics, they're often older parts of cities. There are areas that are established for decades. Places like South Kensington in London is a place that's extraordinarily walkable. It's very human scale. It's what we call the 10-minute city. Everything is within 10 minutes. So I think if we are trying to reset today and create a much healthier environment, you start with this notion that everything needs to be of a pedestrian scale. Now, one might say, oh, the climate is difficult, et cetera. Well, the climate's difficult pretty much everywhere on the planet. The question is, how convenient can you make things so that a child can walk to school, so that you can walk to 2 or 3 or 4 different grocery stores and other commercial activities? You don't need to be getting into your car to do everything every time that you want to go out. And this is something that seems obvious, but frankly, we've not been doing it for decades now. So what I have found is that if you create medium density development that is walkable, that has the facilities that you need, day in, day out uses, you actually create a pattern of life which is fundamentally a healthier one. So in other words, instead of going to the gym for your 10,000 steps, you actually just make those 10,000 steps without even noticing it. Yeah. And I think many of you have experienced that in certain European cities when you visit the city, and if you're actually tracking your steps, you find, oh my gosh, I walked 15,000 steps or 20,000 steps. But it's truly painless. So I think we need to come back to a human-centric design at the scale of the district, at the scale of the city. And that's very much what I'm involved with now in shaping a new district of Riyadh.
You spoke about the climate being a factor in design. What strategies do you use when you're designing a master planned community, keeping in mind the environment you're designing in and climate? Does it differ, or are the strategies the same?
Obviously, depending on the climate, most cities either have a cold climate part of the year or a hot climate part of the year. Some of them have both, if it's in the Midwest, in the US, for example. I think you still have to design for the favorable months, but then you need to consider what are the things that you can do to enhance those more difficult seasons. I don't think it's ever going to be that comfortable to be walking around outside in August in the Middle East, unless you're up in Asir or at high altitude. But I think what's important is that you think about the shading, you think about the scaling of the city. If you look at some of the older districts, for example, Al-Balad of Jeddah, you find that the shading of the streets is actually done very, very carefully. You find that certain orientations of streets are more narrow than others to provide that shading, and that buildings are shading each other, and there's a microclimate that's established. I did the master plan extension of Fez, Morocco, and I learned a lot from the Medina. The Medina itself is 6 degrees cooler in summertime than the countryside around it, and it's actually even sometimes 8 or 10 degrees cooler than the rest of the city. So I think if we actually use some of those principles that are timeless, you can get a lot of mileage out of really reducing that ambient temperature. We are also embedding, in the case of Diriyah Gate that I'm working on in Riyadh, we're embedding technologies to semi-cool some of the public spaces. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that the widths of the streets are capable of doing that. And we've learned lessons from, for example, City Walk here, where perhaps things could have been done a bit differently, so we've studied what's worked there, what hasn't. We've actually done full-scale mock-ups in Sharjah to actually test technologies, and we're going to be employing them to create a better exterior environment. And actually, this is very important, coming back to one of the points that Paul made earlier. People are spending an extraordinary amount of time indoors. So part of the solution is make the indoors better, but another part of the solution is get people back outdoors. Yeah. And this is one of our missions. The living room of a community should be outdoors, not indoors.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm part of the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction, and we're working on educating property managers and people in the built environment on the importance of having buildings and communities be more resilient. In your opinion, how does focusing on healthier buildings, so looking inwards, impact or have a positive impact on sustainability goals? Where is the relation there? Because I see a lot of people looking at both topics separately rather than as one. Do you believe we should look at them separately, or do you believe?
No, I actually think it's part of the same challenge. It just has a different timeline. Mm-hmm. What's very interesting, it's hard to get this data in this part of the world, but in the US you can actually get data where you can see what the life expectancies are, where if you will, the healthiest districts are, and you can also see where the higher carbon footprint districts are. And the interesting thing is that if you compare, say, the Back Bay of Boston, which is a very kind of dense mid-rise fabric, you actually have very high life expectancies and a very low carbon footprint at the same time. Now, in that same metropolitan area, if you look out to the west of the city, places like Framingham, you'll find that there's a high carbon footprint and actually a lower life expectancy. So if you create a district where people's living pattern is a fundamentally healthier one, you're actually creating a district which has a lower carbon footprint as well. Okay. So I think in order to really have that correlation between health and sustainability, it's more at the urban scale than at the building scale. But it can be at both scales. But I think the biggest gain is actually at the urban scale, district scale at least.
I agree. A lot of companies, be it asset managers, institutional landlords, look at sustainability and healthier buildings as a costly venture. They believe that there's a lot of investment that needs to be made, but without any clear rewards. In your opinion, how can decarbonization, for example, health and well-being, be turned into an opportunity and economic benefit rather than being looked at as just a cost?
Well, I mean, my own experience, because I've been embracing the well-being dimension of development for decades now. And what I found in a development that I created in Europe, in Poland, starting in 2000, with well-being principles at the heart of it, as well as sustainability principles, we built out over 8 million square meters, so by many measures, the largest project in Europe this century so far. But what was interesting is that we were able to shift the way people lived, in that rather than taking their cars 4 or 5 times a day, they were taking their cars 1 or 2 times a day. Mm-hmm. We were able to significantly impact life expectancy. Turns out that today the life expectancy in that community versus the rest of the city, there's a 12-year delta. In other words, the life expectancy is now 92 years in that community, mm-hmm. as opposed to 80, which is the average of the city. Yeah. And for me, these are the kind of metrics that really matter. Now, to answer your economic question, I can tell you that a lot of investors made a lot of money on that project, because once you create a community which people know is a healthier place, you know, where childhood obesity rate is 10-15% of the rest of the country, it's a license to print money. Yeah. So people really gravitate to those places, and we actually built out ahead of schedule. What was planned for 20 years, we built out in 14 because the sales were just so sustained.
A lot of developers may argue that these are benefits that the buyers or investors in the project would reap in the far future, because you need time to share this data to prove that the concept works. How can we make it so that from the initial stage, they look at this as an economic benefit to them? Because technically it's the developers that are building the cities around the world, and it's very important for them to believe in this, and it's very important for it to make sense for them financially in order to really take it more seriously. So do you find that it's a hard conversation with developers, or they see it?
You know, the beauty is, if I refer back to that community, it was based on economic principles. And what do I mean? I wanted to save as much money on infrastructure as possible. Normally, the road department was asking for 6 lanes of road, or they'd ask for 4, whatever. I'd give them 4 if they asked me for 6. I'd give them 2 if they asked me for 4, because we redid all of our calculations based on the walkability of the community. Okay. Because they were assuming, as in most cities today, everyone's going to drive everywhere. Yeah. But once we actually repositioned that, we were saving an enormous amount of money to make a place that was extraordinarily walkable, that then allowed us to enter a virtuous cycle of a lifestyle that made walking a pleasure, that made kids access to playgrounds much easier. Mm-hmm. The overall environment was just a safer environment, a more engaging environment. And at the end of the day, it produced a much more efficient building pattern. Yeah. Another important aspect was that we didn't build very high and we didn't build very low. We actually selected the optimal height in Europe for a building economically, which is 5 or 6 floors. Okay. Anything lower is a bit expensive, anything higher is a bit more expensive. So we took that sweet spot economically, which turns out to also be a sweet spot in terms of the wellness of the people, because we found that about half the people actually walk up the stairs to their apartments as opposed to taking an elevator, etc. But it also meant that the parents were comfortable because they could hear their kids in the playground, because they weren't up on the 20th floor. So the 7-year-old kid, 6-year-old kid could go play on their own in the playground because you could still hear them. So, I mean, there are little, if you will, subtleties that are actually essential in getting that kind of community right. But it was also a very economic move. So I don't think there's a contradiction. I think it's just something that you have to finesse, and you have to know your economics just as a basis for making any decision. But once you're good enough with that, then you can actually create and focus really on the well-being of the people. Interesting. And at the end of the day, what's more important?
Yeah. Interesting, the amount of details that you go through. We're running out of time. I have one last question for you today, Guy. What are your key challenges that you face when developing a master plan development that is focused on health and sustainability? And does it differ from region to region?
Of course, it does differ, but I think some of the challenges are there have been a lot of regulations put into place over the last decades that actually go counter to making communities that are human-centric. So I've already mentioned the challenges with the road department. Yes. Where, in a sense, the road becomes the determining factor of a plan, whereas it should be more the way in which people are going to move around that community, that a child can walk to school, actually should have a choice of multiple schools, not just one school. That was kind of the Soviet microrayon ideas. You ticked all the boxes. Yeah. But people want more choice now. So you need to create a more diverse and rich fabric, and that's often something that's a bit challenging when you're dealing with some of the regulatory guidelines that are in place in many of the more contemporary cities. But they're often regulations that are holdovers from the 20th century. So I think it's time to actually make a more substantial shift to allow for more mixed-use communities. And again, I'll come back to this notion of the 10-minute city, and that 10-minute city does not include the use of an automobile. Yeah. It means you need to walk it, you need to bike it. But once you do it well, it is extraordinarily profitable for everybody. Yeah. Thank you very much, Guy Perry. Thanks a lot for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.